Air Canada is making a bold move that completely undermines Donald Trump's economic war on Canada, and it's a move that exposes just how badly his tariff strategy has backfired. While Trump's 25% tariffs were supposed to bring Canada to its knees, Air Canada just announced plans for massive U.S. expansion in 2026, adding 3 new routes that will funnel even more American travelers through Canadian hubs. But here's the twist. This isn't about helping Americans. This is about Air Canada turning Trump's own economic weapon against him, and the results are more devastating to his agenda than anyone could have predicted. To understand why this matters, we need to look at what Trump's tariffs were supposed to accomplish versus what they're actually doing. When Trump imposed his sweeping 25% tariffs on Canadian goods in March 2025, the plan was simple: force Canada into submission by making their exports too expensive for American consumers. Trump implemented 25% additional tariffs on imports from Canada and Mexico, promising these would remain until such time as drugs, in particular fentanyl, and all illegal aliens stopped this invasion of our country. The White House painted this as using America's economic leverage to secure the border and combat fentanyl. But what actually happened was a complete reversal of Trump's intended outcome. Air Canada says bookings on cross-border routes are down significantly across the industry amid Canadians' newfound aversion to American destinations. Nearly half of Canadian travelers said they are less likely to travel to the U.S. in 2025, thanks to Trump's aggressive rhetoric and tariffs. Forward booking data shows that airline ticket bookings are down by over 70% in every month, through to the end of September 2025. The immediate impact was exactly what economists predicted would happen. Leisure bookings declined by 40%, and overall transborder bookings fell by 70% during the spring and summer of 2025. Air Canada continued to reduce capacity on routes to the United States, removing some flights from its summer schedule as tensions between Canada and the U.S. continue rising. The airline was forced to cut service on multiple U.S. routes from Vancouver, including reducing flights to Washington Dulles, Houston, and Miami. But here's where Trump's strategy completely collapsed. Instead of forcing Air Canada into retreat, the tariffs pushed the airline to do something far more strategic and far more damaging to American interests. Canada is using Trump's tariffs as an opportunity to build something far more resilient.
I think we can thrive, and I choose that word advisedly, thrive in this new non-system, or the system that's evolving, for 3 reasons. And the first is we have what the world wants. Take on the energy side, we are an energy superpower. That is going to become increasingly evident. 85% of our energy is clean. We're one of the world's largest LNG exporters, one of the largest reserves of oil and gas. We measure additions to our grid in 10 gigawatt chunks, to put it in perspective, and you will see that with time. We are top 5 in 10 of the world's most important critical minerals. 40% of the world's listed mining companies are in Canada, to give a perspective there. We are a leading developer of AI, and our research universities are some of the biggest producers in volume of AI, computing, and quantum talent in the world. Unfortunately, most of them go to the United States. I understand you're changing your visa policy here, so you're going to hang on to a few of those. We have capital. Our pension funds are some of, if not the most sophisticated infrastructure investors in the world, with all due respect to Larry Fink. And our government, we were talking about him earlier. I have lots of respect for Larry Fink, I should say that. And we have a government that still has fiscal capacity to act decisively at a moment when governments need to act decisively. Now, the second reason why I'd say we have good prospects, not assured prospects, but good prospects, is we have values to which much of the world, not all of the world, much of the world still is.
The Prime Minister has outlined how Canada is adapting to this new reality, discussing Canada's 3 key strengths: having what the world wants, including energy superpower status and critical minerals; values that much of the world aspires to, including a pluralistic society and commitment to sustainability, and recognition that this is a rupture, not a transition requiring decisive action, through building strength at home and diversifying abroad. Air Canada didn't just cut U.S. routes and call it a day. They pivoted to a strategy that turns American travelers into weapons against Trump's own economic agenda. The 3 new routes Air Canada announced for summer 2026 tell a fascinating story of economic warfare disguised as airline expansion. The carrier will return to San Antonio International Airport from Toronto, operating 3 times weekly on an Airbus A220-300. More significantly, they're adding daily service from Montreal to both Cleveland Hopkins and Columbus's John Glenn airports using Embraer E175 aircraft. All 3 routes will operate seasonally from May through October 2026. On the surface, this looks like standard airline route planning, but the strategic implications are far more sophisticated. Air Canada strengthened ties with Lufthansa Group and Singapore Airlines, while expanding codeshare agreements with other international carriers. The airline is building what military strategists would call sixth freedom routes, flying Americans to Europe and Asia via Canadian hubs, bypassing U.S. airports entirely. This is economic jujitsu at its finest. Trump's tariffs were supposed to hurt Canada by making their goods more expensive. Instead, Air Canada is using those same economic pressures to siphon American travel dollars away from U.S. airports and airlines. Every American who flies through Toronto or Montreal to reach Europe or Asia represents revenue that would have otherwise gone to American carriers and airports. And the experts who've studied Trump's approach are sounding the alarm.
With every passing week, more pessimistic about this process. Both tracks, the Canada-US talks that are supposedly underway and the Kuzma review that's now starting, it's clear the Trump administration feels emboldened. They feel they're winning. And I think they're going to give Canada a really hard time as this Kuzma review unfolds. I think the country and the government should prepare for a long and at times painful process.
Do you think, Derek, do you have a similar instinct that Trump doesn't see any negatives right now to keeping these tariffs, in particular on the sectors I mentioned on? And do you think ultimately we're in for a long battle?
Very much with what Brian just said, we need to be very wary of entering into a negotiation with an administration that already is thrown out the one we have and violated every known principle of international trade. So this is not an easy challenge. It may be better to talk than not to talk. But, you know, I don't know what progress, if any, we've made in the discussions we've had with the Americans thus far. So I'm very skeptical. I'm very wary. I don't trust this administration. I don't think anybody should.
Brian Clough expresses growing pessimism about the USMCA review process and Canada-US talks. He explains that the Trump administration feels emboldened and is winning, predicting they will give Canada a really hard time during the review. Derek Burney agrees, warning about entering negotiations with an administration that has violated every known principle, IPL of international trade, and expressing deep skepticism about trusting this administration. The numbers reveal just how badly this strategy is working against Trump's interests. Canadian exports to the U.S. have dropped by about 2% this year, a figure driven in part by tariffs that have made those goods more expensive for American importers. That seemingly small decline is costly and works out to a $5 billion hit to exports. But while Canada loses export revenue, they're gaining something potentially more valuable: control over American travel patterns. Air Canada's expansion targets what the airline calls unaligned markets, mid-sized U.S. cities without dominant hub airlines. San Antonio, Cleveland, and Columbus fit this description perfectly. These aren't massive population centers, but they represent exactly the kind of American travelers who are most likely to choose convenience and price over patriotism when booking international flights. The strategic brilliance becomes clear when you consider the broader context. The number of Canadian residents coming back from the U.S. by car in August dropped 34% compared to the same month last year. The United Kingdom has emerged as Canada's second largest export market, not including the European Union as a whole, displacing China. Canadian exports to Great Britain and Northern Ireland have spiked by 63% in the months since Trump was inaugurated. Canada and Mexico are finding common ground in their response to American pressure.
Canada and Mexico say they're strengthening ties on trade and security as both countries face growing economic pressure from the United States. After a meeting in Mexico City, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum emphasized their commitment to working closely with Washington. Carney told reporters, "We complement the United States. We make them stronger, and we are all stronger together." The renewed cooperation comes as the U.S. imposes heavy tariffs, 50% on Canadian steel, 25% on some Mexican pharmaceuticals, and a 25% so-called fentanyl tariff targeting Mexico. This latest move highlights rising tensions in North American trade.
Prime Minister Mark Carney and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum signed a comprehensive strategic partnership to strengthen economic ties. The new pact includes plans to build infrastructure like ports, rail, and energy corridors, and will complement the Canada-US-Mexico trade agreement. This comes as both countries prepare to deal with Trump's unpredictable trade war ahead of next year's CUSMA renegotiations. Canada is systematically reducing its dependence on the American market while simultaneously making American travelers more dependent on Canadian infrastructure to reach global destinations. It's an economic pivot that would make any geopolitical strategist proud. The psychological warfare aspect cannot be ignored either. Canadians' excitement about traveling to the U.S. has been dashed by the increasingly aggressive rhetoric of Donald Trump, who not only imposed tariffs on Canadian imports but has also referred to Canada as the 51st state and the now former Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, as governor. Trump's own inflammatory rhetoric created the anti-American sentiment that Air Canada is now exploiting. The diplomatic tensions have reached a boiling point.
We don't have a list of domestic terrorist organizations under law in the United States. We have a foreign terrorist organization list, Al-Qaeda, Hamas, for example, but you have to be foreign to be on that list.
And there's no domestic designation because that could infringe on First Amendment rights.
We have a freedom of association under the First Amendment, which means that everybody has a right to create whatever organizations it wants. And you also have the right to believe any ideas that you want under the First Amendment. And you have a right to give money or raise money to organizations that you believe in or support their ideology.
So why has Trump called for this terrorist designation again?
You have not seen Antifa groups in the street confronting the far right for years, and Republicans hadn't been talking about them for years. All of a sudden, it's no coincidence this is happening after the shooting of Charlie Kirk.
The U.S. ambassador expresses disappointment about anti-American sentiment in Canada, stating he's disappointed he came to Canada, a Canada where it is very difficult to find Canadians who are passionate about the American and Canadian relationship. Canadian responses have been swift, with data showing a 34% drop in Canadians driving home from the U.S., decreased U.S. alcohol sales, and increased Canadian author book sales. But the real genius of Air Canada's strategy lies in its timing and scope. The airline plans to grow transborder capacity between the U.S. and Canada by about 15% year over year in summer 2026, even as Canadian leisure travel to the U.S. continues to plummet. This isn't about serving Canadian demand, it's about capturing American demand that would otherwise benefit American companies. The broader economic implications are staggering. These measures could be highly disruptive to the Canadian and U.S. economies. The assumption of wide-ranging 25% U.S. tariffs and full retaliation represents a significant relative price shock for an economy like Canada with strong trade links to the United States. But while the tariffs create short-term disruption, they're also accelerating Canada's long-term strategy to diversify away from American dependence. Trump's tariffs have created what economists call mutual vulnerability, but Canada is managing that vulnerability far better than the United States. The Trump administration's actions on North America are triggering a rethink in both Mexico and Canada of the wisdom of having so deeply integrated their economies with the United States. This may well lead to a loosening of bonds and cooperation in the North American bloc, with negative impacts on U.S. economic and national security. The aviation industry provides a perfect case study of how this plays out in practice. The costs are being felt across the industry, from hotels and restaurants to travel agencies, tour operators, and transportation services. Thousands of jobs are at risk, and without swift and decisive action, the consequences will only worsen. But those job losses are happening on both sides of the border, and Canada is better positioned to adapt. Air Canada's expansion and announcement came alongside news of the airline's broader international growth plans. In June 2026, the carrier will launch new flights to Palma de Mallorca in Spain and Catania in Italy, while resuming service to Budapest and Shanghai that hasn't operated since 2020. This isn't just about replacing lost U.S. revenue, it's about building a more diversified, less America-dependent business model. The strategic implications extend far beyond aviation. Sales volumes of tariffed American products are down 15 to 20% on average this year, and with some categories reporting an even steeper 50% decline. Sales of domestic products, meanwhile, are still up, demonstrating the strong desire by consumers to continue supporting Canadian products and brands. Canada is using Trump's tariffs as an opportunity to build domestic industrial capacity while reducing American imports. What makes this particularly damaging to Trump's agenda is that it's happening with the enthusiastic support of Canadian consumers. A supermarket giant has added more than 100 new Canadian suppliers of various food and other items since the start of the year as consumers turn on American goods out of patriotism or because of higher prices. Trump's tariffs aren't just failing to achieve their stated goals, they're actively helping Canada build the kind of economic independence that makes future American leverage less effective. The failure of Trump's strategy becomes even more apparent when you consider the broader North American context. President Trump's repeated on-again, off-again tariff threats against the United States' two largest trading partners, Canada and Mexico, along with his musings about making Canada the 51st state, have rattled equity markets, created confusion and uncertainty, paused investment decisions, generated mistrust between erstwhile allies, and called the very viability of the North American project into question. Instead of strengthening American influence over its neighbors, Trump's approach is driving them toward greater independence and cooperation with each other. By violating the letter and spirit of USMCA, shaking the foundations of trust that the agreement cemented, and moved by citizens angry with U.S. policies, leaders in both Mexico and Canada will have a difficult time balancing the nationalist currents circulating in their countries with the demands of the Trump administration in future negotiations. The path forward for Canada is becoming increasingly clear.
We should be watching for follow-up on some of these other meetings, and in particular, some of the less exciting, less glamorous meetings. Reed's meeting is an example earlier today, the Prime Minister with business leaders. And the job is pretty straightforward. We are moving into a more turbulent, less predictable economy, one where the market of the United States is no longer as readily available to us as it used to be. We need new trading partners if we're going to sustain our standard of living, if we're going to boost our quality of life. And so what happens 2, 3, 6 months from now? Can we get some of these new trading relationships on a fast track? Can we draw investment and interest from business leaders from around the world to Canada? That's the name of the game. That is the core political test, and that is the core economic test for this prime minister. Can you keep things afloat, even as Donald Trump and his policies, both those directed at Canada and the global economic trading system, appear to be trying to put us all underwater?
Canada's prime minister is developing new trading partnerships as the U.S. market becomes less reliable under Trump's policies. Canada needs to fast-track new trading relationships and attract global investment to sustain its standard of living, describing this as the core political and economic test for the PM, while navigating Trump's policies that appear to be trying to put us all underwater. The aviation industry provides a perfect microcosm of these broader dynamics. Canadian airlines were no longer U.S. dependent, but increasingly global players. Despite the pain, the Trump tariffs ultimately catalyzed a healthier, more diversified future for Canadian aviation. Reduced U.S. dependency. The U.S. now accounts for a smaller, though still significant, percentage of total Canadian airline revenue. Air Canada's expansion plans represent more than just business strategy. They're a direct challenge to American economic dominance in North America, every American who chooses to fly through Toronto or Montreal instead of connecting through a U.S. hub represents a small victory for Canadian economic independence. Multiply that by thousands of travelers and millions of dollars, and you start to see the scale of the problem Trump has created for himself. The irony is that Trump's tariffs were supposed to demonstrate American strength and force concessions from Canada. Instead, they've revealed American vulnerability and accelerated Canadian efforts to reduce their dependence on the U.S. market. Prime Minister Mark Carney and Trump are still in communication, but there has been little progress on the U.S. tariff front in recent months. Trump hasn't done anything to suggest that he's gone too far with Canada, according to experts. The timing of Air Canada's announcement is particularly significant. These routes will launch in May 2026, well into Trump's second term and at a time when the long-term effects of his tariff policies will be fully apparent. If the economic disruption continues, these new routes could become permanent fixtures of a post-American Canadian aviation strategy. What's most damaging to Trump's agenda is that Air Canada's success doesn't require Canada to win some dramatic economic victory over the United States. It just requires them to be slightly better at adapting to the new reality that Trump created. Canadian Airlines responded not with retreat, but with innovation and global ambition. By embracing new routes, upgrading fleets, deepening global partnerships, and investing in operational efficiencies, the Canadian airline industry not only survived the tariff storm, it redefined its future. As the world steps into the latter half of the decade, Canadian carriers stand poised to thrive in an aviation market where agility, diversification, and global thinking are the ultimate currencies of success. The broader lesson here is that economic warfare in the 21st century doesn't work the way it did in previous eras. Countries can't simply be bullied into submission with tariffs and threats. Instead, they adapt, innovate, and find new ways to prosper, despite, or even because of, economic pressure. Trump's tariffs haven't made America great again. They've made Canada more independent, more globally connected, and ultimately more competitive. Air Canada's expansion announcement is a perfect symbol of how Trump's economic nationalism has backfired. Instead of forcing Canada back into line, the tariffs have pushed Canadian companies to think bigger, reach further, and build the kind of global partnerships that make them less dependent on American approval. The result is a Canada that's more economically resilient and a United States that's more isolated from its most important trading partners. As we move deeper into 2026, the success or failure of strategies like Air Canada's will determine whether Trump's tariff gambit was a masterstroke of economic diplomacy or a catastrophic miscalculation that weakened American influence across North America. Based on the evidence so far, it's looking a lot more like the latter. Trump's tariffs were supposed to make America great again. Instead, they're making Canada great instead.